The small southern airport buzzed with noise, jet engines humming, footsteps clattering, voices overlapping in a restless hum. The summer air hung heavy, sticky with heat, pressing down on everyone inside the cramped terminal. Jamal Carter stood, near the gate, his sharp gray suit crisp despite the humidity. His fingers tightened around the handle of his worn leather briefcase, his father's old one, patched but proud. Inside it were his resume, his dreams, and a photo of his little girl, all pushing him toward a job interview that could change everything. His dark eyes flickered with hope, a spark of ambition lighting his tired face. He adjusted his tie, took a deep breath, and stepped toward the jet bridge. At the plane's entrance, Marlene, the flight attendant, stood with her arms crossed. Her thin lips pressed into a tight line as she scanned the boarding passengers. When Jamal approached, her blue eyes narrowed, locking onto him like he didn't belong. He handed her his ticket, first class, paid for with months of overtime, but she barely glanced at it. "What's in that bag?" Marlene's voice cut sharp, loud enough to turn heads. "I need to check it." Jamal froze, his heart thudding hard in his chest. "It's just my papers, my briefcase for work." Marlene didn't budge. "Open it now, you don't look like first class to me." The words hit like a slap and Jamal's stomach twisted. Anger flared hot in his throat, but he swallowed it down. He couldn't afford to lose this chance. Not with his daughter counting on him, not with the interview waiting. Slowly he set the briefcase on the floor and unlatched it, his hands steady despite the tremble inside. Marlene leaned over, her fingers hovering like she expected trouble. Around them, passengers shuffled past, their eyes darting toward Jamal. A man in a polo shirt muttered under his breath, "What's he up to?" A woman clutched her purse tighter. Her lips pursed. Others just stared, their silence heavy, piling onto the shame creeping up Jamal's spine. He wanted to shout, to tell them he'd earned this seat, this trip, but he bit his tongue. His father's voice echoed in his head. "Keep cool, son. Prove 'em wrong with what you do, not what you say." From the cockpit door, Captain Ellen Hayes watched it all. Her gray-streaked hair was pulled tight under her pilot's cap, her face lined with years of hard-earned grit. She'd fought her own battles, men who said she couldn't fly, bosses who overlooked her for promotions. Now, seeing Jamal's shoulders stiffen under Marlene's glare, something snapped awake inside her. Her jaw tightened and her fingers curled into fists at her sides. This wasn't right. She'd seen too much of this kind of nonsense before. Marlene straightened up, tossing Jamal's ticket back at him like it was trash. "Fine. Go sit. But I'm watching you." Her tone dripped with warning, like he was a problem waiting to happen. Jamal picked up his briefcase, closing it with care. His chest burned with the sting of her words, but he wouldn't let it show. He straightened his suit, smoothing the wrinkles, and lifted his chin. "Thank you," he said, his voice low and even, a shield against her hate. He walked to his seat, every step a quiet fight to hold on to his dignity. The murmurs followed him down the aisle. "Should have checked him twice," someone whispered. "You never know," another voice added. The air felt thick, pressing against Jamal as he sat down, his briefcase resting on his lap like armor. He stared at his hands, forcing himself to breathe slow, to stay calm. He'd faced this before, the looks, the doubts, but it never got easier. Ellen stayed by the cockpit, her eyes still on Jamal. She could feel the wrongness of it all, like a weight she couldn't shake. Her mind flashed to a time she'd been called too soft for the job, her skills ignored because of who she was. Now she saw it happening again, different, but the same. Her frustration simmered, a spark ready to catch fire. She didn't know Jamal, but she knew enough. Something had to give. Jamal settled into his seat, his fingers brushing the briefcase's worn leather. He thought of his daughter's smile, the promise he'd made to give her a better life. That was worth more than Marlene's cold stare, more than the whispers. He wouldn't let them break him, not today. But as the plane's engines rumbled to life, a question hung heavy in his mind. Would he have to fight this alone? Or would someone, anyone, see him for who he really was. Ellen lingered a moment longer, her hand on the cockpit door. She didn't move, didn't speak, but her eyes stayed fixed on Jamal. The air stretched tight between them, waiting for what came next. Jamal stood in the narrow aisle, his briefcase, still open from Marlene's first jab. The plane's engines hummed low, a steady pulse under the growing storm inside him. Marlene wasn't done. She waved a hand toward the jet bridge, her voice slicing through the cabin. "We need an agent out here. This ticket needs checking again." Her eyes stayed on Jamal, cold and hard, daring him to argue. Jamal's chest tightened, a hot rush of anger surging up his throat. He clenched his jaw to keep it in. This wasn't just about a ticket. It was about him, his skin, the way she saw him before he even spoke. Fear clawed at him too. Fear of missing his interview, of losing the chance he'd fought so hard for. His fingers gripped the briefcase handle, knuckles whitening. He wanted to yell, to demand why, but his daughter's face flashed in his mind. He had to stay steady for her. A young gate agent hurried down the aisle, his badge crooked, his face flushed with nerves. Ma'am, what's the problem?" he stammered, glancing between Marlene and Jamal. Marlene pointed at Jamal like he was a stain. "This guy, I don't trust him in first class. Check his ticket, make sure." The agent fumbled with his scanner, his hands shaky under Marlene's glare. It already scanned fine," he mumbled. But he didn't meet Jamal's eyes. The rules bent fast, too fast, because Marlene said so, because the system let her. Jamal felt it like a weight on his shoulders, the way people assumed. He didn't belong. No proof needed. "That's not good enough," Marlene snapped. She stepped closer, her voice rising. "Open that bag again, let's see what he's really carrying." Jamal's heart pounded louder than the engines. "I already showed you," he said, keeping his tone even, though it took everything he had. "It's my work stuff, that's all." Marlene ignored him, reaching for the briefcase herself. Before he could stop her, she yanked it from his hands and flipped it open. Papers spilled out, his resume, his notes, a crumpled photo of his little girl smiling at the park. They scattered across the aisle, his pride torn open for everyone to see. His breath caught, a sharp sting of shame burning behind his eyes. Man in a golf shirt smirked from his seat. "Told you he's trouble," he muttered to the woman next to him. She nodded, her lips tight. Across the aisle, a teenage girl fidgeted with her phone, her face uneasy, but she didn't speak. The rest just watched, their silence louder than words, piling onto the humiliation sinking into Jamal's bones. He couldn't take it anymore. Jamal straightened up, his voice low but firm. "I'm not leaving this plane. I paid for my seat. I'm going to my interview." His eyes locked on Marlene's, a steady fire in them. He wouldn't run, wouldn't let her win, not this time. His defiance rose like a shield, fragile but real. From the cockpit, Ellen Hayes saw it all. Her hands balled into fists, nails digging into her palms. She'd fought her own wars, years, of snide comments, of proving she could fly better than the men who doubted her. Now, watching Jamal stand tall while Marlene tore him down, those old battles roared back. Her chest ached with a mix of fury and recognition. She'd been there, judged for what she was, not who she was. The passengers' stares pressed in on Jamal, every pair of eyes a judgment he didn't deserve. He could feel them, some curious, some hostile, branding him a threat before he'd even sat down. His throat tightened, but he kept his head up, refusing to let them see him crack. He thought of his father's words. "They'll try to bury you, but you keep standing." And he did. Ellen's resolve started to fray. She paced a step in the cockpit, her boots heavy on the floor. Duty told her to stay put, to let the crew handle it. But her gut screamed something else, something right. She couldn't just watch this man fight alone. Her hands unclenched, then clenched again, her heart racing as she wrestled with the choice. Marlene tossed the briefcase back at Jamal's feet, papers still strewn around. "Sit down or get off," she barked, her voice sharp with irritation. "We're done here." Jamal bent to gather his things, his fingers brushing the photo of his daughter. He tucked it close, a quiet promise to keep going. He took his seat, the briefcase back in his lap, but the air stayed thick, tense, waiting. The engines growled louder, the plane ready to move, but nothing felt settled. Ellen lingered at the cockpit door, her breath shallow. She looked at Jamal, his back straight, his face set. She didn't know what came next, but she knew she couldn't stay silent much longer. The hum of the plane filled the space, a held breath stretching tight, leaving everything on the edge. The plane's engines thrummed steady, a low growl vibrating through the cabin, but the air inside crackled with something sharper. Jamal sat rigid in his seat, his briefcase still at his feet, papers half gathered after Marlene's last attack. His chest burned, the weight of every stare and whisper pressing harder. Then a voice cut through the noise, strong, unshaken. "This flight isn't taking off." Captain Ellen Hayes stepped out of the cockpit, her boots hitting the aisle, with purpose. Her gray eyes blazed, fixed on Marlene. Not until everyone is treated right. Marlene spun around, her smugness faltering for a split second. "What are you talking about? I'm handling this." Ellen didn't flinch. She took a step closer, her voice low but fierce. "Give him his stuff back, all of it, now." Her words landed like a hammer, cracking the control Marlene had clung to. Jamal looked up, his breath catching. For the first time since he'd boarded, someone saw him. Really saw him. His shoulders eased, a flicker of strength rising as he reached down to scoop up his scattered resume and the photo of his daughter. His hands moved slow but sure, piecing his dignity back together. Ellen's stand poured fuel into the fire he'd been holding inside. Marlene's lips tightened, but she didn't move fast enough. A new voice broke in, shaky, but clear. "This isn't fair." A teenage girl, no older than 16, stood up a few rows back. Her hands trembled, but her eyes were steady. "He didn't do anything wrong. You're picking on him for no reason." The cabin hushed, the hum of the engines filling the silence. A man in a polo shirt shifted in his seat, his smirk fading. The woman next to him frowned, her purse loosening. In her grip, whispers started, soft at first, then louder. "She's right," someone muttered. "What's this about anyway?" The shadows of bias that had hung heavy began to thin, doubt creeping into the passengers' quiet judgments. Ellen stood taller, her jaw set. The radio on her belt crackled to life, a sharp voice barking through. "Captain Hayes, get this plane moving or you're done. You hear me?" She grabbed it, her knuckles whitening, and clicked it off without a word. She wasn't backing down, not now, not for this. She'd spent years proving herself, clawing past doubts and sneers. This was bigger than her job. This was right. Jamal finished gathering his things, his fingers lingering on the photo of his little girl. He tucked it into his briefcase and snapped it shut, the sound sharp in the tense air. He looked at Ellen, then at the girl, a spark lighting in his chest. He wasn't invisible anymore. His eyes shone, not with tears, but with something new, something strong. He sat up straighter, his spirit lifting like the plane should have. Marlene's hands dropped to her sides, her voice shrinking. "You can't do this," she said, but it came out weak, hollow. The passengers' murmurs grew, their eyes shifting from her to Jamal, then to Ellen. The power she'd wielded slipped away, crumbling under the weight of what they all saw now. Her hate had no ground to stand on. Ellen turned to Jamal, her gaze softening for a moment. "You're worth more than this," she said, quiet enough for just him to hear. Then she faced the cabin again, her voice steady. "We move when this is fair. That's it." The plane stayed grounded, its engines humming like a heartbeat, holding still. Jamal clutched his briefcase tight, his breathing easier now. Ellen's words, the girl's courage, they wrapped around him like armor. Together they'd stopped the machine of prejudice, if only for this moment. The air felt different, lighter, alive with something unbroken. A few passengers clapped, tentative at first, then stronger. The man in the polo shirt looked away, his face red. The teenage girl sat back down, a small smile breaking through her nerves. Marlene stepped back, her shoulders slumping, the fight draining out of her. The cabin buzzed with a new energy. Not loud, but real. Jamal felt it in his bones. A rush of hope. A taste of triumph shared with the woman who'd risked everything to stand with him. Ellen moved back toward the cockpit, her steps firm but her heart pounding. She'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross, and she didn't care. Jamal watched her go, his hand steady on his briefcase. The plane hadn't moved, but something had. Something big. The moment hung there, bright and raw, a victory carved out of the mess. The cabin felt lighter, the air less thick, as Marlene grabbed her bag and shuffled toward the jet bridge. Her shoulders slumped, her sharp edges dulled by the weight of what had just happened. The gate agent followed her out, muttering something about a report, but no one cared to listen. The shadow she'd cast over the plane lifted, leaving a quiet that wasn't heavy anymore, just still, like the calm after a storm. Jamal stood at the gate, his gray suit creased from the fight, his briefcase tucked under his arm. He took a slow breath, steadying himself, then stepped back onto the plane. His shoes clicked soft against the floor, each step firm with a strength he hadn't felt when he'd first boarded. A woman in a red sweater nodded at him, her eyes warm. An older man tipped his head, a small sign of respect. Jamal's chest swelled, not big, but enough. He slid into his seat, his spirit unbroken, maybe even stronger. Ellen Hayes settled into the cockpit, her hands steady on the controls. She grabbed the intercom, her voice ringing clear through the cabin. "Folks, this is your captain. We're taking off now. Not just as a flight, but as a stand for dignity. Everyone deserves that. Let's go." She clicked off the mic, a fire in her gut. She'd risked it all, and it felt right. The engines roared to life, louder now, carrying her words into the air. Jamal rested his head against the seat, his fingers brushing the worn leather of his briefcase. The plane tilted upward, climbing fast, and he let his eyes drift to the window. Clouds stretched out, white and endless, washing away the weight of the day. His heart lightened, a flicker of hope sparking. Again, the interview waited, his chance, his future, and he could feel it coming closer. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was pushing forward. The teenage girl sat a few rows back, her phone tucked away now. She'd spoken up, her voice shaky, but sure, and it stuck with her. She thought about her little brother, about the world he'd grow into. Maybe her words, small as they were, could mean something bigger one day. She smiled to herself, a quiet promise to keep trying. Ellen gripped the controls, the plane steady under her hands. She'd fought her own battles, years of proving she belonged in this seat, and today she'd fought for someone else. It changed her, sharpened her purpose. She glanced at the sky ahead, wide and open, and felt a strength mirror Jamal's own. She wasn't just a pilot now, she was part of something more. The flight leveled off, the hum of the engine softening into a gentle rhythm. Peace settled over Jamal, a quiet healing after the chaos. He'd faced the stares, the doubts, and come out the other side. His briefcase sat in his lap, a reminder of his talent, his grit, things no one could take away. He thought of his daughter, her laugh, and knew he'd keep going no matter what. A man across the aisle cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Good luck at that interview," he said, his voice gruff but kind. Jamal turned, surprised, and nodded. "Thanks," he replied, simple but real. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A crack in the wall that had stood between him and them. The plane pushed on, cutting through the sky, leaving the small southern town behind. Ellen kept her eyes forward, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Jamal rested his hands on his briefcase, his mind on the road ahead. The fight wasn't over, not out there, not in the world. But today, they'd won something. A spark of progress glowed, small but bright, hinting at a new day coming. The air felt clean, the future close, and for now, that was everything.